Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about Chapter 6 in our textbook on wages and labor. This chapter is actually called What Employers Owe Employees. And the way I break this down is by talking about two kind of components to what employer or a business has an obligation to their employees around. And that is culture, right? Workplace culture, the environment itself of the workplace, and then secondly, wages, right? Um, so also my notes are a little bit different than what goes on in the chapters. So the notes are not supposed to replace the reading, they are a supplement, and it kind of goes off in some different directions that I think are relevant and interesting. So the way I like to start off the discussion on this is by noting a early labor law, the 1833 Factory Act. This Factory Act, this is quite a while ago, and this is in the height of the Industrial Revolution. There are lots of factories, and this is really focused on child labor. It says that there can be no child workers under the age of 9. Um, Children 9 to 13 are to work no more than 9 hours a day. Children 13 to 18 work no more than 12 hours a day, and so on and so forth. This is a pretty harsh law in the sense that it gives you a sense that of who's really working in these factories, right? The idea is that there are children who are 7 and 8 working more than 9 hours a day. So they need to put these restrictions in place. Um, I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Mainly, it gives a little bit of perspective about what we think is normal or okay in the workplace today. Um, Notice that they don't mention anything about days off, right? The idea is that a 9-year-old kid could work 9 hours according to this law, in line with the law, given the restrictions. A 9-year-old kid could work a 60 some odd hour work week. Um, that seems really appalling to us nowadays. And um, there's a lot packed into what we think is okay or normal into our workplace today. For example, we tend to think that children 9, 10, 11 years old should not be working, let alone working in a factory. We tend to cling to or assume that something like a 40-hour work week is the way things should be done, right? That people should have vacation or sick days and this kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of work that had been done, has been done over the past couple centuries to get us to a place where those kinds of norms around employment have been kind of established, right? And so um, what we're going to be looking at is some of those norms, right? And how they kind of shape and kind of questioning them, not taking them for granted, right? So as I mentioned, I break this down into two main topics, culture and wages. I'm going to start with culture. This is the more ethereal one. I'm sure many people have heard of this idea of corporate culture, right? It's a more general kind of, or it falls under a more general heading of organizational culture. Corporate culture, of course, would be specific to corporations, but any time you have a group of people together, working on some kind of common goal, certain norms get established in that group, right? And that's what we mean by organizational culture. Norms are written or unwritten rules of conduct. Sometimes they're implied, but you get group norms when we have a class together. You have group norms at school or work, within your family, and so on and so forth, right? These are just behaviors that are accepted and behaviors that are not accepted, right? And this is, you know, one thing about this to note when you're talking about cultural norms or you're talking about social norms in this way. This is distinguished from some kind of official code of conduct or something like this. For example, we have a code of conduct at our school. It doesn't necessarily mean that that really articulates the way students actually behave or what are the actual values of professors or anything like this, right? Part of cultural norms or social norms is whether or not we respect certain rules, right? Just because you have a written rule doesn't mean that people really follow that, and how they follow it. Are they very strict about it? Or do they kind of allow a lot of exceptions and stuff like this, right? So, cultural norms, I give a list of some things around this, has to do with, the actions and behaviors of individuals that are accepted or not accepted, the values we emphasize, the values we don't emphasize, the way we speak to other people, right? Notice that this varies quite a bit from context to context. Like if you think about like something like Hell's Kitchen, where, it's become commonplace to think about chefs as like screaming at people in the kitchen. That doesn't necessarily fly like in an office, right? And so those are very, very different norms, which rules you follow, which rules you don't follow, how much you communicate with people, whether it's okay to bring something to your boss, whether or not it's okay to talk to your boss's boss, this kind of things. All these things set a tone about what it is okay to do and what it's not okay to do, right? And the thing about a culture in this way is that it gets established whether you like it or not, right? You get a group of people together, they start doing things, and norms get set. People have to talk to each other, people have to do things, and when they do them in a certain way. And they tend to, and people pick up on what that is and whether things are okay and whether things are not okay, right? Um, and these kind of cultural norms, if they're not addressed, right, they can oftentimes form in very kind of maladaptive ways, right? So these are what you call systemic issues within a workplace or an agency, right? Um, an individual, I make a distinction between an individual issue and a systemic issue, right? An individual issue is an issue or problem that really kind of resides in an individual, right? So if you have, for example, let's say you have a worker who, or a workplace, a factory floor, and a lot of injuries are happening, right? And you start to realize that there's actually two people that are drinking on the job or something like that. And those people are fired or given, go to rehab or something like this, right? Then all of a sudden your rate of incidents goes down because the problem was a particular problem with those individuals, right? However, if you have something like very, very high quotas, and the way in which people, in order to meet those quotas, they have to forego safety inspections, right? Then, if you fire a couple of people, those incidents are not going to go away. They're going to continue to go because the way things are set up, the norms, what is expected of your employees is kind of unhealthy in and of itself. Right? Systemic issue has to do with the cultural, the norms, what kind of behaviors are accepted, not accepted, promoted, this kind of thing, right? And so removing, for a systemic issue, removing the individual that's at fault does not really help, right? Even though sometimes it looks like an individual that is having the issue. Um, the example I give, which I think is a helpful one to understand this idea of systemic issues, is a dictatorship, right? Um, Now, a dictatorship, oftentimes when we talk about, many people think dictatorships are not good forms of government, right? But of course, a dictatorship is a form of government where one person, all the power is pretty much consolidated to one person, right? Um, But when we talk about a dictatorship, being established, we tend to not be like, well, what's this person like? Are they nice? Right? That's not usually the question that comes forward first, right? Why is that? If all the power is given to the one person, why are we not so concerned with their character? The reason why is because we tend to think that a dictatorship is a systemic problem, right? That consolidation of power gets rid of a lot of checks and balances and accountability that we think is more prominent in something like a democratic or republic, right, system. And so it's not really a question of the individual, right? Even if you get rid of the particular dictator, if you put another person in place, you still have the same kind of problems, right? That's not an individual problem, that is a systemic problem. Now, of course, there can be dictators that are major tyrants and some that are more benevolent in some way, but the idea is that at the end of the day, the real root of the problem is the system, right? That's established there. Cultural issues are systemic like this, right? And so, the reason why I mention this is because when we're talking about what employers owe employees, a lot of the issues, the main issues that come up in terms of unhealthy workplace, things like discrimination, safety issues, workplace harassment, low wages, all this kind of stuff is oftentimes systemic in its orientation, right? If you have discrimination, there's usually a pattern of discrimination, right? And just firing one person is not going to do much, right? Or replacing one person or adding someone else, right? If you have serious safety issues, it's usually has to do with, certain norms around what is expected of workers, right? Workplace harassment, when these things come about, oftentimes you have a series of people who are looking the other way, and you have a lack of mechanisms within the company to allow for communications, reporting, trust, all that kind of stuff, right? And so if you want to tackle those kinds of issues, you really need to think about them in a systemic sense, right? And so this is one thing that one angle or one kind of component that uh, employers owe employees, something that we take for granted. We think that if you get a job, it should be a safe, fair workplace, right? And that takes a lot of work. So that's why I kind of bring up all the issues about understanding systemic issues. The second topic is wages. And when it comes to wages, I think the broad question that I like to raise is how do we gauge a fair wage? We talk about a fair wage quite a bit. And the way I like to introduce this is by talking about a Hormel strike, a strike at a Hormel meatpacking plant in Minnesota. I think it was in the early 80s or something like this. And they coined the phrase cram your spam because they produce spam. And the strike, I think, lasted like a number of years. I have a link if you want to kind of look at it. But the interesting context around it is that in the 70s, an average worker at a Hormel plant that was working on the factory line for meat production made what would be about $100,000 in today's money, right? Given inflation and all that kind of stuff. Um, and they were striking because their wages kept going down and down and down, right? Today, one reaction to this might be say, wow, that's way too much money for someone to make for doing some kind of factory labor job. And then the question that I like to raise is why, right? Why is that too much? You might also think it's too little. I also give the statistic or the fact that when the COVID stimulus came out, the cutoff there for people who didn't get the stimulus was $150,000 for a household per year. right? I think that number doesn't come out of thin air. I think they probably gauge that number based on what a person really needs to be able to sustain or hold out via something like that kind of disruption in income or potential disruption in income. And so, I think there's a lot to be said about where we kind of get this idea of a fair wage, right? Are there jobs where people shouldn't be able to get a living wage based on what? Right? If someone's making hamburgers, does that mean that they shouldn't be able to pay their bills or pay rent doing that? So anyways, and based on what, right? And so the other kind of general thing about this, um, uh, pulling from the philosophers that we've discussed is, for example, Kant thinks that it's never okay to exploit someone else, or it's never okay to use someone else, right? For your own ends as a means to an end. And it seems like any sense of employment is always using someone to a means to an end. You only employ someone based on the idea that you will make money off their labor, right? And we see this in Marx, that, the capitalist earns capital based on exploited labor, right? So in that light, you might think that no real employment opportunity really is really fair, right? On the other hand, we look at something like Smith. Smith really kind of emphasizes the idea that it's a mutual understanding, right? It's mutually beneficial. And I think a lot of us have experienced this. You need money, you get a job, you get paid for it, you show up, you do some stuff, and you get a paycheck. And it's kind of like that's a mutually assured, as a mutually assured or mutually agreed upon um, um, uh, agreement, right? And so you might think that that's okay and that's good. But of course, when does it get out of whack, right? There are also, would you say predatory kind of uh, agreements around this kind of stuff, people being paid too little or asked to do too much, worked overtime for no pay, so on and so forth, right? So um around this, some questions I raise around this is, what kind of factors can prevent a employment agreement from being genuinely consensual, right? So, for example, are you forced into taking a job, and what are those elements in terms of location, maybe things going on in your life, so on and so forth, right? And then I also asked the question, what kind of features of the working environment are expected, and that might be implied that you might not actually bring up at an interview, right? To go back to the idea of culture. Um, and also, should any job provide a living wage, right? And I think that's really significant. There's lots of part-time work out there. There's lots of gig work. Um, there are things like internships, unpaid internships, and you might think that those kinds of things are inherently unfair, right? So, those are some things to think about when it comes to wages, and culture. I hope this sparks some thoughts around the reading and everything, and I look forward to reading everyone's stuff in the discussion model forum and everything like that. Okay, thanks.